Hello, just a quick note about this video. It isn't intended to be a review or anything like that. It is just the web interface of this router to help anyone else who has to remotely support other users who are using this router. It shows most of the web pages of the admin interface and hopefully helps other people remotely supporting users of the router. Hello everyone, we are gathered here today to have a look at the web interface of a HUAWEI H112-370 5G or 4G router, depending what kind of coverage you have in your area. Otherwise known as the HUAWEI 5G CPE Pro, which is Customer Premises Equipment Pro, and Vodafone in the UK call it the GigaCube 5G. This is the login page. It's not on the default IP address in my setup. It's on a custom IP address, and I've set a custom password. However, on the underside of the router is a sticker with the default password on it. On logon, you get the status page, which shows your signal reception bars, what your current throughput is, and whether you've got Wi-Fi enabled and how many devices are connected, how long the current session has been, and how much data you've used. So the most obvious option on this I'm going to go to first, which most people want to change, is the Wi-Fi name and password. Very clear, just click on where it says Wi-Fi settings. On this page you can set whether 5G is the same name as the 2.4 GHz signal. Generally you'd want to select yes on this or have that switched on. There were problems with some devices, say iPad several years ago, where during the roam from the 2.4 to the 5 GHz you'd lose IP connectivity. I don't think that's so much of a problem these days, so having that selected as on is not a problem. A lot of these switches apply the setting immediately. Rather than you changing the switch and then having to click on a save button. It's useful to know if you've got multiple changes you need to make and you need to think about the order which you're making those changes in. There's an option to turn Wi-Fi off entirely, not a good idea. Let's see what else we have under more Wi-Fi settings. You can change whether it's 20 MHz channel or auto, so presumably it can't do 40 MHz channels, at a guess. A really bizarre selection of Wi-Fi channels on 2.4 GHz, so it only goes between 5 and 13. Very strange on that. So this screen has a save button on it. But if I select 20 MHz channels, I still can only select 5 through to 13. Unusual. Under the Wi-Fi security settings, you can have, if you didn't have merged Wi-Fi names, you could have different security options or different passwords for the two different networks. You can have a MAC address filter, which is a really bad idea to use in general these days because it's incredibly easy to get around and see what valid MAC addresses are on a network. And the front of the router has a WPS button on it. If the router is going to be sat somewhere vaguely public and you didn't really want people to be able to connect to your network without knowing the password, just by walking up to the device and pressing the button, it's a great idea to turn off the WPS option on this screen. Back to the home screen. If you click on the signal option, you get your mobile data options to do with what access point name your router is using and whether to allow roaming. So if you took the router into another country and it joined a different foreign mobile network, whether to allow data using that, which could end up quite expensive if you don't have any roaming deal. no settings under the mobile network searching option, and the second port on the back of the router can be used for a main connection. So you could set it for example, PPPoE for a BT Infinity style FTTC connection with an OpenReach modem, or plugging it into just any other dynamic IP network, so plugging it into a cable router or any other router, and it will, I'm not sure whether it uses that as a failover. I'm almost certain it uses that as the main connection, and then should that main connection fail, it then moves on to using the mobile network as a backup. Nothing particularly useful under the Ethernet status. If you did plug something in, so a LAN computer into the second Ethernet port, and then you reboot the HUAWEI router, this screen here changes to showing as being connected over the Ethernet. And because you plug just a computer into it, there's no internet. So all the other computers on the main LAN port or on your LAN or Wi-Fi don't get internet access. If you click on this section here where it shows your current bandwidth throughput, it takes you to a status or a statistics page which shows you how much data you have used. For the current session and total. I'm not really sure what monthly is. We are 11 hours 46 into the month, so the current session started before this month. So that'll be what that is it's breaking it down into different sections of time. You can also set, I presume, either a hard limit or a warning threshold for data usage. Going back to the home screen, click on My Device, and it takes you to the advanced status page. We'll come back to that later. Clicking on the Wi-Fi will probably just take you to the standard Wi-Fi settings, which we've already seen. And clicking on the 6 devices on your LAN takes you to just the devices menu at the top, which we'll go through again in a minute. So we've already been through the network settings, which is where you set all the 3G, 4G, 5G information. And we've already been to most of the Wi-Fi settings. I haven't been under guest Wi-Fi, so let's click on that. And you can enable guest Wi-Fi, which have access to the internet, but don't have access to devices on your main LAN or Wi-Fi. This one, again, if I click that, it will immediately enable that option. I can't do that in this situation, I'm afraid, just because this is in a live network. Moving on to the devices menu at the top. Just shows a list of devices that are connected, how long they've been connected, and their IP address, MAC address, and devices that have previously been connected to the network. It looks like for devices which are connected via the Wi-Fi, you get an option to enable whether they've got internet access or not. Strangely, it looks like devices that may have been connected on the LAN, and I know that one was on the LAN, don't seem to have that option. It's very unusual. Maybe this switches on the MAC address filter, which isn't possible on the Ethernet. Moving on to the tools menu, you've got SMS messages. So if your carrier had sent you a message to verify that you had access to an account, or if you were going to use it for general text messaging, this is the menu you'd do that under. SMS settings. Let's turn on SMS report. And if there's anyone that somehow ever stores the 10 text messages on their SIM card, you can import it into the device. We've been into the statistics menu, which is the totals of data usage. This is definitely wrong. So last cleared was not cleared today. And you can tell that just by the usage here. So we've got 10 gigabytes of usage in the current session, which spans beyond this date here. And we've got 23 total from other days. So Not really sure why that date is wrong there. The parental controls section. It looks like you can allow times at which specific devices are allowed access to the internet. Moving on to the advanced section. In here there will be some things that I will be unable to show you because I've switched those features off and won't be able to switch them back on because this is in use in a live environment. We've been through the Wi-Fi menu. We'll go into the update section. So it can automatically update if you wish, which is on by default as far as I remember. And for our device, it was delivered up to date and hasn't needed an update since it was installed. So that we don't need to worry about. Depending on your installation, so if it's a business, I would recommend turning the auto update off for stability. If it's a home setting where there's regular periods where people aren't in, or overnight where it's not in use, then I would turn on the auto update. Moving on to the router section, you can change whether the IP address it has for its main IP address and turn off or on the DHCP server and the DHCP range that it gives out. Got dynamic DNS or DDNS for no IP or dyndns or similar services. The services it supports are a very small set: dyndns, which isn't free, noip.com, which is free, and one that I've never heard of before, HUAWEI.com. Quite amazingly, this seems to support VPNs and a selection of VPNs. So PPTP, which is fairly old and I think is not a great idea to be using these days, and LTTP, Layer 2 Tunneling Protocol VPNs. So a good example for this particular setup is Vodafone do not give you a public IP address. You are on their carrier grade NAT, where they manage the WAN IP address and you have no ability to do port forwarding. If I show you the device information screen, the WAN IP address that this router gets from Vodafone is a local IP address. There's no way you could give this WAN IP address to somebody else on the internet and they could connect to you. This is where the VPN may come in handy. So if you have a VPN provider who will give you a WAN IP address, you could potentially get around that restriction, that problem. A good example of a service that would definitely provide this in the UK is Andrews and Arnold, who provide L2TP tunnels with a static IP address or possibly even a static IP address range for not a particularly expensive cost per month. So something to bear in mind if you're using this again in a business setting or a home setting where you want to be able to do port forwarding or host services, which you wouldn't be able to do on Vodafone. If you have a 3 in the UK, a mobile or a cell phone company called 3 SIM, they definitely give you a public IP address on your SIM card. So you may want to use this router, but change to using a different cell phone company. Moving on to the security settings. Again, I've changed these from the default. I believe, I can't quite be sure, but the disable WAN ping is enabled by default. In fact, I believe all of these are enabled by default, which are not on this system. MAC address filtering I can't show you due to me changing the settings and turning that function off. The same for the IP filter. Virtual servers is where you would do port forwarding, but as I say, if you do set up port forwarding on this on Vodafone, people still will not be able to get to your IP address. So that's where you would set up port forwards. But as I say, unless you have a WAN IP address that is a public IP address on the internet, setting up port forwards here is going to do absolutely nothing. it looks like maybe if it sees traffic on a specific port, for example 27001, which might be for Half-Life 2, that it could then dynamically open up other ports when it sees traffic on that port. But I don't think I've ever used that kind of function on any router in the past. DMZ settings, which is essentially port forwarding all the ports through to something on your LAN, you can do there. SIP ALG settings. Quite often this causes problems for VoIP. So if you've got a VoIP phone behind your HUAWEI router and you've got problems with calls, especially where they just randomly hang up, just turn off the SIP ALG, because that's likely to be the issue. Universal plug and play, which allows computers on your LAN to do port forwarding automatically. If you're security conscious, you generally want to switch that off. If you want compatibility, so the best chance for torrents to work or games to work, you probably wish to turn UPnP on. However, going back to the previous caveat of the Vodafone SIM, which is in this, does not give a public IP address, so having ports set up using UPnP will do nothing for you anyway. NAT settings. I've left this on default. There's a lot of information about the two or multiple types of NAT, symmetric and cone. There's no way that I can recite those from memory. Your best bet is just to look on Wikipedia or the internet, see what you can find. And the domain filter I can't show you due to the settings that I have on this router. Moving on to the system menu, we have the device information, which shows you IMEI, serial numbers, device name, whether it has its own or has detected its own telephone number, software version, MAC address, WAN IP address, and the cell that is connected to on the mobile network and how much reception it has. You can remotely restart the router, which I'm not going to do. You can also remotely factory reset the router, which I'm definitely not going to do. One-click check. I don't believe I've clicked it. Let's find out what happens when you do. Just seems to see whether it can access the internet and then says normal or not, so not particularly useful. Diagnosis, we can do pings. Let's do a ping to OpenDNS. And there we are. Seems to only do 3 packets, but that's interesting. What other options do we have? Probably traceroute, yeah. So bizarrely, the traceroute doesn't seem to give you actual results of where the packets went. It just seems to say how many hops it went through. A bit bizarre, but there you go. Modify passwords, where you change the web admin password. Pin code to set a pin on the SIM card, I expect. Time settings. With no option to type in your own time server, you have to select from one of their preset lists, and time zone. And system settings. So by default, I believe Link Plus is on, but there is only ever going to be one device in this network, so that's now switched to off on here. You can change whether the light goes out at certain times, so if it's sitting in a bedroom or somewhere where it's sensitive to light, you can tell it to have the lights off overnight. And by default, this option, scheduled restart, is on. Every week between 1 AM and 5 AM, it will reboot itself. And I can't see a reason for that. The only reason I can think is if they don't believe they've built a reliable system and think that it has memory leaks or something else, and doing a scheduled restart is a good idea. I switched it off because if they've sold something like this, it should be reliable. It shouldn't need to restart once a week. We'll see how things go. By default, it will install critical updates, so I presume if that's some horrendous security issue, it will still download and install the update. Online updates doesn't really explain what it is. I expect that if you visit the main web page before logging on, you can still trigger a firmware update without knowing the admin password. Under the antenna settings, you can say whether you're using internal or external antennas. On the back of the device, you can plug in, I believe, 2 external antennas. Hopefully this video has been helpful to you. I mainly make them because if you are supporting somebody who has one of these routers and you don't have access to one of these routers to see where you need to tell them to go in the web interface, this video might be useful because you can fast forward through it, find the section that you need, and be able to talk somebody through exactly what they need to find. If it has been helpful to you, it would be really helpful to me if you wouldn't mind subscribing to my YouTube channel. You don't need to have the notifications switched on, but the subscriber numbers really do help. Thank you very much.